Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're we're traveling deep into history, but not the history you usually see, the triumphant emperors, the shining marble.
Not at all.
We are plunging into the history that Rome tried desperately and for a long time very successfully to suppress.
And it's a history that remained hidden, not because the evidence was just lost to time, but because historians for centuries, they just actively refused to see it.
So what are we looking at today? What are our sources for this?
We're looking at a stack of sources that are incredibly fragmented and often really cryptic. We have some private letters, military archives written in this dense bureaucratic code,
Right.
architectural notes, which are fascinating. And then there's one single, just heartbreaking first-person account scratched into a stone wall.
And what do all these fragments tell us?
They describe an organized, calculated violence. This wasn't, an accident of war or some tragic one-off event. This was systematic. It was institutionalized policy.
So our mission for this deep dive is to excavate those fragments. We want to uncover what Rome tried so hard to erase, which is the systematic policy of violence enacted against female captives after gladiatorial victories.
Exactly.
And to do that, we are anchoring this entire deep dive on one particular spectacle: the games that were held at Carthagon Nova in 146 AD.
To even start, you have to transport yourself out of this, the sunlit arena, the cheering crowds, and go into the darkness beneath it.
Right.
We have these fragmented accounts that describe the subterranean corridors. You have to imagine what that was like. Just complete blackness, broken only by the sudden flare of a torch as a guard walks by.
You can almost hear it.
You can. The chilling sound of heavy boots echoing on cold, damp stone.
Yeah.
And the smell. I mean, the sources mention the smell. It wasn't the clean sweat and sand of the arena up above. It was this suffocating mix of old blood, stale urine, and, this heavy metallic scent that tells you victims had been there long, long before.
It's the atmosphere of absolute certainty, isn't it? The source material forces you to acknowledge the sensory details of that terror. I'm imagining the sound of bound hands scraping against rough hemp rope, nails already weak, just knowing that by dawn you'll be one of those disappeared statistics in the empire's administrative ledger.
And that atmosphere is so crucial for establishing the core distinction of this entire deep dive. What happened in those corridors, it wasn't random cruelty. It wasn't the unfortunate behavior of a few rogue soldiers acting outside of orders.
This was policy.
This was policy. It was so deeply woven into the fabric of military power, into the empire's entire control mechanism, that contemporary historians, they either couldn't or, more likely, simply would not write about it directly.
So how did they write about it or around it?
They relied on coded language, on euphemisms,
Yeah.
and, as scholars now recognize, entire paragraphs of what we can only call deliberate omission. It makes you realize that for nearly 2,000 years, this truth remained hidden, not because the evidence wasn't there, but because the entire intellectual tradition that came after Rome actively chose to participate in the cover-up.
Okay, so let's ground ourselves at that anchor point you mentioned. Carthagon Nova, 146 AD.
Right. Carthagon Nova was a magnificent coastal city in Hispania. It's now Cartagena in modern Spain. It sits right on a cliff overlooking the Mediterranean.
A beautiful place.
A beautiful place. But by the mid-2nd century, its amphitheater was, it was less a venue for entertainment and more a highly efficient machine. A machine designed to demonstrate absolute Roman dominion over the bodies of the conquered and the enslaved. These games were really state-sponsored terror.
And the man who commissioned them? Who was he?
Lucius Cornelius Seiss. He was the governor of Hispania at the time. And we have fragments of his correspondence that reveal a truly chilling philosophy about how to govern. He saw fear as an asset.
As an investment?
As an investment, absolutely. Seiss was a very pragmatic administrator. He was trained in the brutal effectiveness of the Pax Romana. And his philosophy was simple. Fear is a good investment.
What does that mean in practice?
Well, think about it.
Right.
Why would you keep a standing army garrisoned in every rebellious little town year-round? It's incredibly expensive. You need constant supply chains, troop rotations.
It's a logistical nightmare.
A total nightmare.
Yeah.
So why do that when you can achieve the same level of submission through psychological means for a fraction of the cost?
So he's looking at the massive price tag for 5 days of games, the exotic animals shipped from Africa, the elite gladiators, the maintenance on the building, and he's calculating the return on that investment.
Exactly. The initial outlay for a spectacle like this might seem immense, but if those games are brutal enough, if they are shocking enough, if they are unforgettable enough, They create a kind of provincial docility that might last for 5, maybe even 10 years.
So the cost of the games is offset exponentially by the years of what reduced policing, less military deployment.
Precisely. Seas was literally budgeting for fear. His goal was absolute domination. He wanted to make the local population understand at a visceral gut level that resistance was not only pointless, but that it would result in horrors sanctioned by the highest authority of the state.
And it's important to note he wasn't reacting to some massive uprising, was he?
No, not at all. This was proactive. He was managing the perception of threat. He was making sure that any whispers of local defiance were immediately extinguished by the chilling memory of what happened at the last games.
So for this event, he ordered games that would eclipse anything held there before. And he wanted them to culminate in what he intended to be a finale so memorable that it would be talked about for years, but not spoken of directly.
And that phrase, not spoken of directly, that is so critical.
Why?
Because it implies a known shared horror that operates completely outside the official record. It's the mechanism of a rumor mill, but one that's powered by state violence. It's terror that you don't even have to name.
And the women who became the victims of this terrible finale, where do they come from?
They came from a place called the village of Saltus. It was a small coastal settlement, maybe 300 people, fishermen, simple farmers, a few traders. They were not politically significant in any way.
And that's the point, isn't it?
That is the defining aspect of this policy, and it's one that's so often missed in standard histories of warfare. The victims were not leaders of a revolt. They weren't from some politically dangerous faction. They were just in the wrong place at the wrong time.
Which made them the perfect victims for what you called bureaucratic erasure.
Exactly. They were completely disposable within their own power structure. Their disappearance wouldn't trigger any political backlash from the Roman aristocracy or, other powerful local groups. They could simply vanish.
And the administration of their disappearances, it's just horrifying in its banality. The census records for Hispania from 146 AD, they contain this curious, chilling little detail.
They do. The village of Saltus appears, and next to it is the notation, transferred to special assignment.
Transferred to special assignment. What does that mean?
That administrative stamp is the key. It's the proof of systematic intent. We know Roman bureaucracy used specific jargon for everything. If civilians were requisitioned for mining labor, it was labeled opera metallica. If they were conscripted, it was noted.
But this phrase is different.
This was the euphemism, transferred to special assignment, especially when it's applied to an entire village that then ceases to exist on paper. That was the bureaucratic stamp for civilians who were disappeared into the system. It meant they were given to the games.
So it transforms a massive human tragedy, the capture and obliteration of an entire community, into a simple accounting entry.
It does. That jargon, it neuters the horror. It transforms people into resources for spectacle. And it serves as the first and maybe the most powerful layer of historical erasure.
And it sets the stage for the architecture, which is, I suppose, the physical manifestation of that administrative decision. So if the bureaucracy was the first layer of this erasure, then the architecture itself was the foundation of the atrocity. Let's go underground and talk about the actual physical design of this state-sanctioned cruelty.
Well, we have astonishing insight from the designers themselves. There was a man named Marcus Aurelius Tertius. He was a highly sought-after military architect, designed something like 17 amphitheaters across the empire.
So he was an expert.
He was the expert.
Yeah.
And he wrote in a private letter, "The stone cannot know what purpose it serves, but those who place the stone know everything."
Wow.
He was speaking broadly there about the engineering of the space, the vomitoria, the passages for entry and exit. But he was also, you can feel it, he was speaking about the complicity of the design itself.
And there's a reply to one of his letters, isn't there?
Yes, his correspondent in Alexandria, replying to a later, more cryptic letter, drove the point home with a single damning line. He was discovered decades ago in the Cairo archives. He wrote, "Some corridors are built for purposes that must never be documented."
Must never be documented.
Yeah. That is the architectural code. You see, the standard plans for amphitheaters were meticulously documented. Everything for structural integrity, for logistical flow of the crowds. But the passages that led away from the arena floor, deep into the foundation.
The ones that weren't for the public.
The ones designed for moving people and animals, but also for holding, torturing, and ultimately erasing victims. These were the corridors that required a functional secrecy. The architecture itself was designed to facilitate violence and then ensure its visual removal from the public eye.
So the public sees the slaughter of the animals, they see the gladiator fights, but the ultimate act of terror was designed to take place in the shadow of the main spectacle.
Precisely. And we have specific evidence of the preparation for this. It was found in some planning documents in the 1990s. They're in a private collection now.
Hmm.
These documents, they outline the entire event with this startling bureaucratic specificity.
Like what?
I mean, the archives meticulously documented everything. The types of animals, the specific ludus, that's the gladiatorial training school, from which the fighters were leased, the payment schedules, and then there it is, in cold detail, listed right under necessary resources.
What does it say?
The specific number of captive women needed for the finale, 20.
20, not a few or whatever captives are available, a specific number.
A calculated number, 20.
Yeah.
Integrated right into the procedures, and the logistics flow like any other resource.
And is there any other administrative detail that confirms this was policy?
Oh, yes. The detail that confirms this was policy and not some spontaneous riot is the specific instruction added to these planning documents. It reads, "The victors will have 3 hours. Ensure the corridors are clear of guards after sunset."
That sounds like an operations manual.
It is. This is operational manual material. It wasn't a last-minute decision by some overly enthusiastic governor. It confirms the system had defined parameters, it had a time limit, and it had a structural preparation clearing the guards built in for the atrocity.
That specific detail, clearing the guards, that just shows the level of state organization. This wasn't chaos. This was policy that was formulated in offices by administrators who sat at desks and codified sexual violence as a scheduled event.
And the cells beneath the amphitheater, they confirm the systematic nature of it all. They weren't just repurposed storage rooms.
They were purpose-built.
The subterranean chambers were purpose-built holding cells, about 8 feet by 10 feet, stone pens, heavy iron grates. They were designed for controlled function and efficiency, just like the cages built to hold the lions or the pens for condemned men before their execution.
And the preparation of the victims themselves is maybe the most difficult part of the sources to read, because it illustrates this chilling logic of optimization.
It does. The 20 women from Saltus, they were kept down there for 3 days before the games even started.
And they were cared for, in a way.
In the most cynical way imaginable. They were given sufficient food and water, and their health was even monitored by a physician.
So why? Why the medical care? Why the feeding and hygiene?
Because the Romans were optimizing the procedure. This was based on long, terrible experience. The goal was not immediate death. Death is a mercy, and it also reduces economic value.
So what was the goal?
The goal was controlled, managed, shattering trauma. And this required the victims to be physically viable for what was coming, and critically viable for future economic use as slaves or concubines or mine labor afterward.
It's the ultimate reduction of a human life to an asset. A living, healthy person, even a traumatized one, is economically worth more than a corpse.
Exactly. The policy was designed to maximize the terror and at the same time maximize the return on the state's investment in these human resources.
Which brings us to the other side of this transaction, the victors. Let's focus on a man like Titus, the retiarius from southern Gaul. Now, for the audience, a retiarius fought with a net and a trident, right?
Yes, a highly skilled gladiator. Relied on speed and cunning, these men were celebrated heroes. They were temporarily elevated, revered almost like gods on the arena floor.
But only temporarily.
Right. As soon as that battle ended, Titus was still the enslaved property of his ludus, his training school, and ultimately, he was the property of Rome. And that's the crucial psychological contradiction that the empire had to manage.
So?
Well, they created these incredibly powerful, desperate men who knew they could kill anyone. They were masters of violence, yet they were fundamentally unfree. So how do you maintain the loyalty of a man who lives constantly on the brink of revolt?
You give them a safety valve.
You do. The women were a specific, time-limited, controlled form of dominance granted as the ultimate prize to the winners.
It's diabolically clever social engineering, isn't it?
It is. Rome needed these powerful, violent men to remain angry, but that violence had to be directed outward, at non-Roman civilians, at the truly powerless. By offering them absolute power over defenseless people for one night, Rome affirmed the gladiators' temporary dominance within the system, even as that system maintained his overall enslaved status.
So it serves a dual function. It's an act of state-sanctioned terror against the captive population.
Yeah.
And it's a powerful psychological tool for the control of the empire's most dangerous enslaved men. It makes them complicit in the oppression of others, which just reinforces the entire empire's control structure.
The violence is integrated into the reward system itself. The prize isn't just money or temporary freedom. The prize is the right to inflict sanctioned violence that reinforces the entire hierarchy.
Let's detail the final moments of the public spectacle on that fifth day. Titus, he defeated Marcus of Italia in a brutal, spectacular fight.
Yes, the crowd's roar would have been deafening. He received the laurel wreath. He was the temporary god king of the arena.
But the main spectacle was over.
Right. The second event was announced simply as an exhibition of the captured populations. The 20 women were brought out. They were likely in clean white tunics, which would have been a stark contrast with the bloody sand.
What would the crowd have thought?
To an uninitiated visitor, it might have looked like a bizarre parade, or maybe the prelude to some new type of contest.
But the crowd understood the code.
The crowd understood. They watched as the women were led not to the center of the arena floor, but directly to the southern corridor that descended beneath the earth. The massive gate closed behind them.
And what's so striking in the contemporary accounts is the silence.
The silence. The crowd in the stands remained silent. Their silence was their participation in the policy of omission. They knew exactly what that coded presentation meant. There was no applause, no jeering, just a profound, chilling silence, acknowledging the state's ultimate power to enact horror behind closed doors.
And the official records, of course, they just end there.
Of course. Game successful, crowd satisfied. End of story.
But the administration continued into the darkness. At the bottom of that deep descending corridor, in a larger chamber prepared with oil lamps, the assembled victors were waiting.
Yes. Not just Titus, but 5 other winners from the 5 days of games. They were all there, gathering their state-sanctioned prize.
And the logistics of this atrocity were standardized. You mentioned letters.
We have fragments of coded administrative letters. Like one found between Alexandria and Rome. It refers to the expected duration for this. It's part of the event. And the note specifies, quote, consistent with previous installations, approximately 3 hours until dawn.
3 hours until dawn. Written by some administrator who understood the exact nature of the horror being timed, but recorded it in this bureaucratic language that shielded him from any moral consequence.
It's the ultimate example of administrative detachment from atrocity.
But the administration didn't even stop once the time was up, did it?
No. The administrative manual, the one preserved in Claes Johannes' collection, it contains specific provisions for the aftermath. And here is the truly shocking detail. Bandages and salves should be provided.
Medical care after the atrocity.
Precisely. The goal was not utter physical destruction. The goal was breaking them in specific manageable ways that would ensure compliance and docility while absolutely maintaining their economic value. If they were too severely injured to travel, they were a loss on the balance sheet. They needed to be viable.
So the distinction is crucial. A single random act of violence is a tragedy.
Yes.
But 100 rapes, organized by an empire, documented in operating manuals, timed, medically attended, and integrated into the reward structure of the military apparatus. That's not a tragedy. That's a technology of state control. That is terrorism by policy.
And the evidence of that policy is overwhelming, but perhaps the most powerful sources we have are the ones that were never, ever intended to survive.
The ones left in the darkness.
Right. The only monument these women were able to create for themselves. The scratches in the stone.
Tell me about those.
The corridor walls beneath the arena, they were covered in them. Names, tally marks, fragments of prayers, hundreds of them, scratched in desperation by women who had stood in that exact darkness before. They knew they were part of a terrifying continuity.
And the sole detailed first-hand account we have. It was found during restoration work in 1952.
Yes, it was painfully learned Latin, scratched into the stone. The restoration team photographed it, and they immediately and deliberately replastered over it with mortar.
Why?
The official reason was to protect the dignity of the site.
To protect the dignity of the stones over the voice of the victim.
That decision tells you everything you need to know about the historical resistance to this knowledge. But the photographs, thankfully they survive, they've been circulated among historians.
And what did the woman write? Those 6 words.
She wrote, "They will break what they cannot take."
They will break what they cannot take.
That phrase is so profoundly significant because it articulates the victim's immediate comprehension of the state's intent. She knew death would have been preferable, but that wasn't the goal.
No, the goal was to shatter her. Permanently.
Right, to leave her alive but irrevocably broken in a way that ensured compliance and erased her spirit. They understood the objective was breaking, not killing, because a broken asset is still an asset.
And that breaking was immediately followed by an organized dispersal.
Yes. Within the next week, the survivors were sold off. We see records of them being transported to brothels in Carthage or Alexandria, sent to work in the dangerous mines of Sardinia, kept as concubines of provincial officials. They just they vanished into the massive, sprawling Roman system of forced labor and sexual slavery.
They became completely abstracted.
Completely. We see this in the household records of a provincial governor. One woman appears listed simply as acquired from gain status labor.
The category, not a person.
Not a person. She remains a line item in those records for 12 years performing domestic tasks before she vanishes entirely. Either she died or she was sold again. The documentation machinery reduced her entire existence to an economic abstraction.
And the source of the victims, the village of Saltus, was also systematically erased.
It completely disappeared from census reports, from administrative maps. After 146 AD, the state didn't just break the people, they deleted the origin. Rome's strategy was holistic. You delete the source, you delete the connection, and you manage the memory by ensuring no one can ever trace these women back to a specific community or a family that might mourn them.
It's just comprehensive.
It is. And yet, despite this comprehensive effort, traces of survival remain, which just speaks to the resilience of the human spirit, even under that kind of extreme duress.
What kind of traces?
We have scattered records. They mention communities founded by women who had survived the games, women who couldn't return to their old lives or homes because their families wouldn't or couldn't take them back. So they traveled far beyond Roman territory into what the Romans called barbarian lands.
And there's one specific community mentioned, right, in a 3rd century report.
There is. A Roman military report mentions a community located somewhere in the forests north of the Rhine, living in association with Germanic tribes.
And what's interesting is the reaction to that report.
This is where the policy of erasure runs into a snag. The Roman officer who wrote that report, maybe out of some genuine shock or sympathy, I don't know, he noted that these women had managed to retain agency, that they had a sound mind despite their experiences, and had formed a cohesive, independent settlement.
And the reaction from Rome.
He was immediately and severely reprimanded.
Why? Why would they reprimand him for that?
Because even suggesting that these women retained any dignity or agency was completely counter to the state's narrative. Rome needed them to be completely degraded, completely broken, completely without self-worth. The possibility of their survival, their adaptation, their independent reformation of community that had to be denied by the state to maintain the psychological impact of the original trauma.
So the initial trauma was perpetrated by the empire, but the campaign of erasure was sustained by history itself.
For centuries. Post-Roman and medieval historians, they had access to the same coded sources that we're looking at today, but they made a profound choice.
They chose omission.
They chose omission. They chose to gloss over and hide these truths to protect the prestige and authority of Rome. For generations, Rome was held up as the pinnacle of Western achievement, the fountainhead of law, engineering, Christian virtue.
And this story doesn't fit that narrative.
Admitting that the empire integrated systematic sexual violence into its operational manuals would have severely damaged that carefully constructed narrative of moral superiority. So the evidence just sat there, waiting for scholars who are willing to break through that silence and look at the sources with a different kind of lens. And the first major breakthrough came from a place of profound lived experience with systematic violence. We're talking about Jerry Mueller in the 1960s.
She was a survivor of the Holocaust.
She was. So she knew precisely what systematic documentation of atrocity looked like. The bureaucratic language, the euphemisms, the administrative coldness used by perpetrators to deny what they were doing. When she applied that lens to the fragmentary Roman sources describing the games, she recognized the pattern immediately.
And she published a paper on this, Methodologies of Erasure.
She did. And she argued that ancient history was filled with this systematic documentation of state-sponsored sexual violence if you just knew how to read the jargon. And the response, it was brutal.
It was met with outright suppression.
Complete suppression. She was accused of anachronism. The argument was that you can't apply 20th century definitions of genocide or systematic violence to ancient Roman practices. They said she was imposing modern moral frameworks. They dismissed her findings as feminist hysteria.
So the resistance wasn't just academic disagreement.
Not at all. It was institutional self-protection. It was a refusal to allow a modern understanding of trauma to challenge the foundational myth of Rome.
So she died without seeing her work widely accepted, but she opened the door.
She opened the door.
Yeah.
And it led to scholars like Patricia Chen in 1985, She published institutional practices in the post-spectral period, and she provided the academic description of systematic, institutionalized rape built directly into the operating procedures of the amphitheater system.
And I'm guessing she faced the same backlash.
The same swift, hostile backlash. She was fiercely criticized for reading the sources through a modern feminist lens. It highlights this profound discomfort in the historical community. Many were willing to accept that Rome was brutal, that they killed millions in the arena.
Sure.
But accepting that the violence was gendered, that it was organized, that it was specifically aimed at psychological destruction to maintain economic value, that was far more threatening to the narrative. She, too, was forced to abandon that line of research.
And the psychological cost of seeing this truth was immense, even for the scholars themselves. There was David Pritchard, a British historian.
Yes, he translated many of these letters in 1992. And he was so disturbed by the bureaucratic coldness of the evidence that he wrote this personal essay in a small journal describing the experience.
What did he say?
He wrote about the moral responsibility of the historian when you're dealing with sources like this. He realized he was reading the documentary evidence of systematic sexual violence, and he described the painful necessity of forcing himself to see it for what it was, because the victims themselves had no ability to look away when it was happening. The documents, he argued, demand recognition.
So the documentary evidence forced open the door, but it was the architecture that slammed it shut on all possible alternative interpretations. And that's thanks to modern archaeology.
Right. That brings us to Margherita Pelosi's findings at Carthagon Nova in 2011. And she had the tools that Muller and Chen didn't. The stones, as she discovered, they simply do not lie about their function.
What did you find?
Pelosi used ground-penetrating radar, careful excavation, to map the structures beneath the arena floor. And she documented sound isolation features.
To muffle screams.
To muffle screams from the crowds above. She documented the specific dimensions of the subterranean chambers, the holding cells that matched the exact specifications mentioned in the administrative documents.
So there was no other explanation.
These structures could not be explained by any other functional purpose. They were designed not just to hold people, but to process them in a controlled, invisible environment.
And when Pelosi was asked directly by reporters if the structures were designed for this policy of violence, she had a truly powerful response.
She did. She said, "The stones don't lie. The architecture makes the purpose unmistakable. What I cannot do is force people to see what doesn't want to be seen."
Force people to see what doesn't want to be seen.
And that quote, it just encapsulates the entire enduring resistance. It is profoundly easier for the human mind to accept that something terrible happened randomly than to accept that something terrible was codified as policy.
Why is that?
Because the latter, the policy, implicates the entire Western intellectual and historical tradition that was built on the idealized foundations of Roman law and civilization.
And even now, we see historians and classicists arguing about the scope of the practice, right? Whether it happened in every amphitheater or only a few.
Right. As if arguing about the quantity somehow makes the existence of the policy itself acceptable. It's the final psychological defense mechanism against institutional denial.
So we've traveled through the darkness beneath the arena, through the bureaucracy that timed the atrocity, the psychological manipulation of the gladiators, and the institutional denial of history. The evidence, it seems undeniable. The scratches in the stone, the administrative documents, the architecture itself.
It is. This history wasn't accidentally lost. It was deliberately hidden by centuries of institutional effort.
And Rome's ultimate goal wasn't just physical harm.
No. Their technology of control aimed for complete erasure, the obliteration of the victim's memory, the deletion of their origins, and the denial of their agency. They wanted the women of Saltus and all those like them to be completely forgotten, reduced to line items in a ledger.
But the memory survived. The women from Saltus couldn't write books, they couldn't offer testimony in the forum, but their only monument is the knowledge that their story survived the machinery that was designed for their complete destruction.
The system almost achieved its goal. For 1,500 years, it relied on the complicity of historians and the convenience of just looking away.
And that brings us to the listener's role, the obligation to remember.
It does. When that archaeologist covered up those 6 words in 1952, he made a decision. He decided to hide a painful truth. Our obligation, now that we know what the documents and the architecture reveal, is to refuse to participate in that hiding.
The women waiting in the dark, in the stone, leaving those desperate scratches, they were wrong about one thing. Rome tried to take everything, but they did not succeed completely. The simple fact that we are discussing their story today, pulled from the administrative margins of history, is an act of restoration.
The greatest act of defiance against a system designed for complete erasure is the simple act of refusing to forget. And that brings us to the final thought for you to consider. What does it mean for us today that their story survived, when the entire weight of the Roman Empire and subsequent history tried to bury it? And what systems today in our own societies depend on our participation in the forgetting, the intentional looking away from the policies that create suffering in the shadows? That is the burden of this knowledge, and the challenge that now falls to you.